Hello, historians. Welcome back to Cocktails and Cliff Notes. I'm your host, Mason, and today I'm going to request something of you, and that is that I want you to forget everything that you think you know about America's founders, because today we are serving up the intoxicating truth about the women who secretly shaped a nation. Only to be banished from the history books. Now, these are not your typical historical figures. They're the rebel spirits that you've been waiting to meet. We're going to be uncovering the overlooked brilliance of America's founding mothers. We're pouring into the lives of women like Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren, and we're going to be dissecting their pivotal and often uncredited contributions to the nation's birth. We'll reveal how their intellectual prowess and their political maneuvering helped shape the revolution, proving that history's narrative is far from complete. However, before we get into that, I'm going to pour us a quick drink, something simple. But if you do want to skip that, use the timestamps below to get right into our story. Now, when I say something simple, I mean something simple because I'm telling you right now, I've really just been on a simple champagne kick. We're just going to do a glass of champagne. We're going to make it as sparkly as we can. We're just going to celebrate the new year and celebrate good things. I have been drinking more champagne than usual because I've been celebrating a few blessings, and you can't celebrate without champagne. I wonder who did champagne's marketing, because I really do feel like you ring in the new year, you celebrate good things with champagne. Who decided that? I don't know, but I'm glad that they did. So we're going to take our sparkly glass. We're going to take our sparkling drink. Let's fill that up just a little bit though, because I'm going to add some actual edible sparkles to this, and they can tend to make this bubble. So if it bubbles over, I'll just do my best. Maybe I should not do it over my computer and my microphone and like everything that I love and that's very expensive. There we go. This is just edible glitter that you can get at Walmart. You can get this at any liquor store. And if you just dump it on the top, the bubbles will start to sift it through. But, champagne can be a little bit moody, so it's going to get taller. But it's so pretty. Oh, I hope you can see that. It's so, so pretty. Can you see that that is like a disco ball that I am about to drink? You guys, I want you to be able to see how pretty that is. Can you tell? I think it's starting to kind of settle down, so we can go ahead and top it off a little more. Just a little. I'm really trying to enjoy champagne while I'm drinking it because it's the new year. It's time to get healthy, at least for a couple months, but I'm going to drink some champagne and celebrate. So, cheers to the new year. And with that, let's get into our story today. This is going to be a sparkling adventure. Now, let me ask you one simple question. Do you think that you know American history? Because you might want to think again. What if I were to sit here and tell you that the revolution wasn't actually shaped only by men in tricorn hats and powdered wigs? What if it was also shaped by women who were pouring tea, hosting dinners, writing letters, and very quietly steering the course of history from their drawing rooms? Not as footnotes, not as symbols, but as strategists, propagandists, financiers, couriers, and influencers in a world where power very seldom announced itself openly. Now, historians sometimes call these women the forgotten mothers of the revolution, not because they were absent, but because their influence was rather subtle, it was very domestic, it was deliberately overlooked by generations of storytellers who very much preferred battlefields to parlors. Now, these women, they did not command armies, they just commanded conversations. They shaped political loyalties over the supper table. They passed intelligence through embroidery, of all things, and simple pieces of correspondence. And they ended up raising sons who would eventually grow to lead a nation. They argued with their husbands, and these husbands of theirs thought they already understood liberty in its entirety, and these women were there to challenge such a notion. At times, they hid spies. They would move money, they spread ideas, and these ideas, if they were spoken too loudly, they could result in exile or possibly even execution. So, tonight we're pulling back the curtain. We're going to shed a little light on it. We're going to light some candles and we're going to talk about it. Because once you see how these women really operated, how deeply they influenced the men that we still call founders, the familiar story of the American Revolution starts to feel a bit incomplete. There are just a few gaps in the narrative. The war didn't only unfold on battlefields and in Congress, it was also unfolding in people's living rooms, in their kitchens, and handwritten letters that had to be passed from person to person, hand to hand. Now, by the time you hear what these women were really up to, you may never look at history the same ever again because we're going to go back to the drawing rooms and we're going to begin with a woman whose influence stretched far beyond the walls of her Massachusetts home. From Braintree all the way to Philadelphia and then even all the way to Paris, we are beginning today's story with Abigail Adams. Now, Abigail, she did not hold office, she did not sign the Declaration of Independence, and she never commanded a crowd. Yet, very few people in all of history helped shape the revolution more consistently or more intimately than did she. She was first and foremost brilliant, and she was denied a formal education because she was a woman, but she took it upon herself to go ahead and get educated anyway. She read voraciously. She was really into history, philosophy, law, political theory. She absorbed the Enlightenment. If you go watch the Freemasonry videos, they talk about Enlightenment a lot, and that's the Enlightenment that we're talking about. She absorbed that, not necessarily as an abstraction, but more as a framework for living day to day. Her letters to her husband actually reveal a mind that was very incisive. She loved irony and she was utterly unwilling to be dismissed. Now, John Adams, he was not writing to his wife to escape the world of politics. He actually wrote to her often to understand it better, which is very impressive on Abigail's part. Their correspondence actually spanned decades, and they became one of the most intellectually alive partnerships of the era. Now, while John was debating independence in Congress, Abigail was at home and she was managing the household, managing the finances, she was raising the children, and she analyzed a lot of the political currents that were swirling around her. And she did so oftentimes a lot more clearly than the men in the chamber. Now, in March of 1776, as John was sitting in Philadelphia helping to decide the fate of the colonies, Abigail wrote the line that would echo through history. This line being, "Remember the ladies." Now, this was not a polite suggestion, this was more of a warning. She urged her husband to consider how laws might affect women because she was trying to caution him that power in the hands of men would actually mirror the direct tyranny that they were resisting. If the new nation were to replace one form of unchecked authority with another, she argued often that the revolution would be far from complete. Now, John's response to this was very teasing. It was slightly dismissive, but it revealed quite a lot. He joked about the despotism of the petticoat. Now, I want to just let you know because I had to Google the meaning of the word despotism. It's not something that I've heard in modern language ever, but despotism is the exercise of absolute power, especially in a cruel and or oppressive way. So even in jest, he acknowledged the threat posed to complacency. Now, Abigail wasn't asking for the vote, she was just demanding accountability. And that was only the most famous moment. Throughout the war, Abigail was John's eyes and ears back home. She was reporting on a lot of shortages, on morale, on local unrest, and shifting political loyalties. Because people were a bit wishy washy then. They were wishy washy before then, and they're wishy washy now. And we know this. So when British forces were threatening Massachusetts coast, she was actually giving John a full report from her own doorstep, which is insane. Can you even imagine being like, "Oh, it's a lovely evening. Oh my God, what is that? I can hear it from my porch." She was just over there writing down little letters like, "Oh my God, I think something exploded." I just assumed that I would be like hiding under a table somewhere. I would be so scared of everything. Anyway, I just want you to know that these were not exactly sentimental letters. Come home, my sweetheart. I miss you. These were intelligence briefings. Her insights really, really mattered. John Adams really did trust her judgment on a deep and personal level. And when he worried about public opinion, she reported how people were reacting on the ground, on ground zero, level one. She was like, oh my God, I heard them in the supermarket. Did they have supermarkets back then? No, definitely not a supermarket. They had general stores, I would think. That's going to be something we're going to look into when we're stores a thing. Anyway, I'm just making the point that she was looking out for her husband and she was reporting back to him often. So when he questioned certain alliances or policies, she offered him very unfiltered analysis of what she truly thought, and she did not hold back. She challenged his assumptions all the time. She sharpened his arguments, and she reminded him that ideology meant little if it collapsed under human cost. So later, when John was sent abroad as a diplomat, first to the Netherlands and then later to France, Abigail actually joined him. And she quickly proved herself to be very indispensable because she got in there and she did something. She navigated European courts like she was born to it. I mean, just perfect discipline, great perception. She was sharp, you guys, sharp. She was really taking it upon herself to observe how these foreign elites really viewed the American experiment. She really understood social dynamics. She caught on to subtle slights really, really quickly and all these unspoken hierarchies that were just swirling around. And these were intelligences that rarely appeared in formal dispatches, but they influenced how John approached negotiations quite drastically. So in Paris, she watched the French monarchy with a skeptical eye and very quickly noted the gulf between aristocratic luxury and public hardship. And this was years before the revolution over there actually erupted. And these observations actually ended up shaping the Adams family's very famous caution of French politics and French alliances. Now, Abigail Adams, she was not somebody that was over there just whispering from the margins. She advised, she criticized, she interpreted power, and she did so from a position denied formal authority. She was using intellect, she was using correspondence, and relentless clarity to insert herself into the political bloodstream of the revolution. She was going to make her voice heard. Really, if the American foundation was more of a conversation and not necessarily a decree, she was not listening from the other room. She was sitting there right at the table with them with her pen in hand, and she was helping shape the argument. And she was really only the beginning because Abigail Adams was not alone in her brilliance. There were many women like her. Across Massachusetts was yet another formidable mind at work, and this is one that chose a different weapon entirely. She did not choose the private letter. She did not choose diplomatic observation. She actually chose the pen or the quill, and this particular quill was sharpened directly into satire. Now, this is Mercy Otis Warren. If Abigail Adams was shaping the revolution's inner circle, it was Mercy Otis Warren who was working on the public conscience. Mercy Otis Warren, she was born in 1728 into a very politically active Massachusetts family, and she was actually educated at home alongside her brothers. She spent a great deal of time absorbing classical literature, political philosophy, and history. Now, this was a real rarity for women of her time. Most women didn't get educated in these ways, but she had those brothers, and thank God she did, because what she lacked in formal authority, she replaced with something far more dangerous to the British establishment, and that was a public voice. She used that public voice and she used it relentlessly. She did not give a damn. As tensions in Britain were escalating, Warren actually began writing these political plays and pamphlets that blended drama with mockery and very, very sharp analysis. Now, her works were often published anonymously or under different pseudonyms, but their targets were unmistakable. Royal governors became these villains. She had corrupt officials that were becoming these over the top caricatures, and British authority was actually exposed not as noble governance, but as a farce. And satire was her genius. And this is at a time when rebellion actually could still feel really unthinkable, and satire in its own way kind of made it laughable, and then it seemed a little bit more possible. By turning these really powerful men into objects of ridicule, Warren helped strip the crown of its psychological authority. Once people laughed at power, they kind of stopped fearing it, in a sense, and to some degree. I'm not going to say that they were like, oh, that was funny and now I'm not afraid, but it was like, ha, she's made a good point, you know? Now, her plays, they circulated all over the place in pamphlet form. They were read in taverns, in homes, in meeting houses. They weren't necessarily meant for these grand theaters and these major productions. They were meant to be shared, repeated, argued over. They kind of invited these ordinary colonists into the political conversation, kind of got their wheels turning in a slightly more lighthearted way. Mercy Otis Warren wasn't telling people how to think, more so, she was teaching them how to think critically about the powers that be. Now, her influence expanded well beyond propaganda. And after independence, while many people were out there celebrating with a glass of champagne, Warren actually turned to history. Now, in 1805, she actually published a detailed book called The History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. Now, this was one of the first comprehensive histories of the war, and one of the only histories of the war that was written by someone who had lived at the center of its political world. It was a very interesting take, and this was not necessarily a neutral account of what happened. She wasn't just telling you the facts, she was deeply concerned that the ideals of the revolution were already eroding. She warned against political power, unchecked authority, and the rise of certain political elites could possibly resemble the very aristocracy that America had rejected. Now, her critiques were very bold, and sometimes so bold that it was a little bit uncomfortable, because she questioned everything, including the Constitution's balance of power, and she challenged the emerging political class. She warned that liberty could not be lost to kings, but to ambition. Now, some of the founders didn't particularly love this, and John Adams, who was once a very close friend of hers, felt very personally attacked. Now, their relationship actually ended up fracturing under the weight of all of her criticisms, but others really did seem to recognize the value of her perspective. Thomas Jefferson, he was one who actually admired her greatly. He praised her intellect, her moral clarity, and her dedication to these Republican principles. And I'm not saying Republican as in the Republican Party. I'm saying Republican like the republic in which we stand. But the point that I'm making is that to Thomas Jefferson, Warren actually represented something that was crucial and essential to the American experiment. And this was a citizen who was both willing and bold enough to speak truth even when it wasn't entirely popular. And that really might be her greatest legacy, because Mercy Otis Warren didn't simply help to ignite the American Revolution, she helped to hold it accountable. And there weren't a ton of people who were bold enough to do such a thing. She really did understand that independence was not an ending, it was very much a beginning. And without vigilant critique, revolutions tend to decay into mythology. And through satire, she really dismantled imperial authority. Through history, she challenged American complacency. And in a nation still learning how to actually govern itself, Mercy Otis Warren reminded its leaders of a very uncomfortable truth. And that's that liberty does not survive through reverence, but through relentless examination. With that, the revolution's most dangerous voices actually stepped fully into view, and they're not on horseback or behind cannons. They're seated at their desks, rewriting the future one sentence at a time. Now, Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren, they are only the beginning. Their names really survive, and we feel like we know them pretty well because they left all these letters, they left all of these books and correspondence behind. But beyond these two women, there were dozens of others whose influence was no less real, even if history did take it upon itself to tuck them into the footnotes. These are women who spoke through poetry. They helped to manage money and morale, and they turned culture itself into a battlefield. Now, one of the most remarkable of these is Phillis Wheatley. Now, Phyllis was born in West Africa. She was enslaved as a child and she was brought to Boston. When she got to Boston, she mastered English, she mastered classical literature and poetic form at astonishing speeds. Her poems were not merely artistic achievements, they were actually political acts. Now, this was at a time when slavery was justified by claims of intellectual inferiority, and Phillis Wheatley's work really dismantled that lie line by line. Her poetry engaged Enlightenment ideas, Christian morality, and classical symbolism, and this forced a lot of her readers to confront a massive contradiction at the very heart of the revolutionary cause. How could a nation demand liberty when they were denying it to others? When Wheatley wrote a poem honoring George Washington, he was so impressed by it that he invited her to meet him personally. Now, that moment mattered, and it mattered a lot. Now, this was not because this particular moment erased injustice, but it definitely did help to expose it. Her very presence challenged the boundaries of who was actually allowed to speak in the revolutionary conversation. So, if Abigail Adams argued for accountability within the law and Mercy Otis Warren challenged power through satire and history, it was Phillis Wheatley who expanded the moral horizon of the revolution itself. Then there was Esther DeBert Reed, whose influence was not philosophical, but it was more logistical and no less vital. So in 1780, the Continental Army was struggling with massive shortages and severe morale deficits. So Reed took it upon herself to organize a massive fundraising campaign among the women of Philadelphia. She framed this not as a charity, but this was a patriotic duty. And she got people involved and she did it at astonishing speeds. I mean, my God, women were out there contributing money, clothing, tons of time spent doing whatever they could to help the Continental Army, including but not limited to sewing shirts, raising funds. They coordinated distribution. And Reed even authored a broadside urging women to recognize their political responsibility to the cause. This was not symbolic support. This was not a good hoorah from the sidelines. This was straight up infrastructure. Armies march on supplies just as much as they march on ideals, and Reed's efforts directly improve conditions for soldiers in the field. And this very, very keenly demonstrated that the home front was not passive. It was straight up operational. And these women were not abnormalities. They were part of a larger informal network that moved ideas, money, labor, and influence across all colonies in a time when doing something took a whole lot of effort and everything was dangerous. And I think the expected lifespan at that time was probably like 37 years old. I mean, it was a tough time. Those were some dark days, but each of these women played a different role. Somehow together, though, they formed something extremely essential, and that was continuity. I mean, they got in there, they got it done. It was shockingly impressive. While armies were advancing and retreating and kicking ass, then getting their asses kicked, and it was going back and forth, and their feet are cold and they're very hungry, these women were back home. They were maintaining the households, communication networks, supply chains, public morale. They were helping to shape the stories that people were telling about the war and the meaning that they were assigning to those stories. The revolution was not just a single front. It was this great tapestry with all of these different threads of poetry, persuasion, organization, endurance, and they all were woven together into something resilient enough to actually become a nation. And when we begin to see these women not as exceptions, but as participants that were operating within the limits and possibilities and the gender of their time, the story of American independence grows much richer and it's far, far more honest. Because these revolutions are not sustained by heroes alone, they are sustained by communities, active members in society, and many of their architects never stood in the spotlight at all. So, why does any of this matter today? We're here, it's 2026. We're taking a look back at history that's been told and retold through the same narrow lens for generations. And I'm not knocking it, I'm really not. But I'm really just pointing out that the stories that we tell about history also do help to shape the future, and they shape what people believe is possible. And for a long time, American history has been framed as this procession of great men making great decisions in great rooms, which is all true. I am not saying that that is not true, but that particular version is very tidy, it's very easy to teach, and it's still incomplete, in my opinion. When we start looking at stories of people like Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, Phillis Wheatley, Esther DeBert Reed, we replace myth with humanity. And let's not forget about the countless other women whose names we may never know. But I just want to point out that when you tell history just a little bit differently, or you include some of these forgotten characters, we don't diminish the founding itself. We strengthen it. It's a complement. They go hand in hand, and we trade simplicity for direct truth. That these were hard times with hard people making hard decisions, doing very hard things. I really feel like these women remind us that power doesn't always look like traditional authority and that influence doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always have to be so loud. And that history is shaped not only because of those who speak the loudest, but by those who speak persistently, sometimes quietly, until ideas really do start to take root. And I do feel like re-examining the past helps us to ask better questions of the future, like who is missing from the stories that we tell today? Whose labor is dismissed as background noise, and whose ideas are shaping the world without any credit. Inclusivity is not necessarily about rewriting history to make it comfortable. I think that's very, very dangerous, but it is about seeing it much more clearly. And my hope is that when younger generations actually look back at a more complete past that's filled with thinkers, organizers, writers, and strategists who look and behaved similarly to them, they worked within the constraints of their time, of their gender, and the petticoat. I just hope that the past stops feeling so distant, so far away, so impersonal. It becomes very usable if you look at it like that. It becomes instructive, it becomes constructive, and it's very much alive. The American Revolution was never a single story. It was a chorus, it was a choir, it was many voices singing together in messy, messy harmony. And for too long, a lot of its strongest voices have been muted or blotted out completely. So maybe it really is just time to do something very, very simple. I want you to pour yourself a drink. I want you to set aside everything that you thought you knew. I want you to open your mind just a little bit and finally give these remarkable women the recognition that they really do deserve. They kicked ass. They were kind of awesome. Because the true story of America's birth is a lot more complex than we were taught. It's a lot more inspiring. And once you hear it this way, I do feel like it's a little bit hard to just put that out of your mind when you're hearing it the traditional way. And I'm not saying that the traditional way is bad. A lot of that stuff did happen and it was so badass. I'm going to talk about it in many episodes to come. I just want these women to have at least 30 minutes on the internet for probably about 50 views, maybe 100 if I'm really lucky. So cheers to Abigail Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, Phillis Wheatley, Esther DeBert Reed, many, many others, and God bless America.